what I want to do in this talk is three things, actually. The first one is to take stock on the magnitude of the gender gap along multiple dimensions in South Asia in general, but more specifically in India. I will, from time to time, go to subnational detail, but it will be mainly the big picture. Where do we stand? Second, I want to review and challenge a bit the way we think about policies to close the gender gap. And finally, I want to say a few words about something that I see as particularly important, which is women's participation in the labor market, female labor force participation. So these three topics. I realize that I may say things that all of you know. This is a knowledgeable attendance, but let me go through it. Some basic benchmarking for South Asia. And I want to start by saying that in some ways, South Asia has been remarkable in terms of women's empowerment. South Asia is the region that had the first female prime minister in the world. That was Ms. Bandaranaike in Sri Lanka. It has had no shortage of extremely powerful and influential women across countries. Benazir Bhutto, Sheikh Hasina, Indira Gandhi. At the state level, we sadly lost recently Sheila Dixit, who presided over a phenomenal transformation of Delhi. So there are many examples that other countries in the world have taken much longer to emulate. It also goes to other modern areas. You may know this, but India is the country with the largest female share of pilots of commercial aircraft in the world. 13% of the pilots, when we fly back to Delhi or to other parts of the country, are women in India. The next country comes at about 5%. So the first thing, as Vijaya was saying, that India has remarkable accomplishments. You look at elections, you look at disasters. Again, the same message. There is no reason why South Asia and India in particular could not be stellar in this domain. But for now, when we look at the averages are not so good. And I want to use here the framework of the World Development Report 2012. The World Development Report is this flagship publication of the World Bank. 2012 report was called Gender Equality and Development. And that report articulated what I find is a useful way to look at the gender gap, which is to look at three things. Assets, what men and women have, and that is essentially, as you will see, human capital in particular. Second is returns. What can you do with those assets? Do you get the same payoff, say, for your years of education if you are a man or if you are a woman? And third, and I will argue the most important one, is agency, is the ability to make decisions. And I would say when there is agency, all the other things fall in place. So let me take that lens and go through the region. First on assets, and let me start with health. And of course, the worst outcome in terms of health is to be dead, not to be born. And so the child ratio, the gender ratio at birth is something where South Asia stands out. On the left, you have one bar for each region, the way we define them at the World Bank, where we consider 6 developing regions. South Asia is the red bar. And you see that with the exception of East Asia, this is the region with the highest ratio of boys to girls at birth, way above what will be expected just from biology. And within the region, India also stands out. So first area where we certainly have an issue. Second aspect of health is nutrition. And malnutrition is an issue in most of South Asia, is an issue in India. Here I'm reporting the result from a study by Jayachandran and Pandey, a study of 2017, which looks at malnutrition by child order, first child, second child, third child, and compares with sub-Saharan Africa, which is the other region in the world where nutrition indicators are not good. And you see that for the first child, South Asia doesn't do worse than Sub-Saharan Africa. Probably the opposite. The red bar is for India, is less in terms of malnutrition than for Africa. But the gap starts widening for the second child and becomes really bad for the third child. And most of this is driven by girls, by girl childs. So the nutrition status of girls diminishes as there are more mouths to feed in the household. On the positive side, on assets, the gap is closing rapidly on education. Here you have the years of education by age group, for the age group that 16 to 25. On the left panel, you have rural India. On the right panel, you have urban India. And you have the overall is in blue, but look at the red is women, the green is men. And you see that everybody is increasing in education. The gap is somehow narrowing in rural areas, left panel. But if you look at the right panel, by now in urban areas, women get more education than men. So here is one area in assets where there has been remarkable progress. There are discrepancies within the country. And here what you see is a map of India and Bangladesh, very detailed at a level of the district with the educational attainment. And here you see the secondary school completion. And secondary school completion, the darker the figure, the higher the rate of secondary school completion. And you see that there are places, especially over the Ganga basin, where and the Ganga and Brahmaputra deltas, where the secondary school completion is not very good. But that in large part reflects also the development, the lower level of development. Because now look at the same map. This is the same map looking not at the level attained, but at the gap between boys and girls in education. And here you see that in fact the east of the country that had the lowest attainment also has the lowest inequality between boys and girls, and it's the west where you see more of that. So this is a picture of uneven progress. The fact that there are places that show high secondary school attainment for girls and low gaps between boys and girls shows that it is possible within India. Second is returns. And on returns, the issue that we face all over the world is that for the same amount of work, women earn less than men. And that can be, here in this map, you see how much less they earn. The red numbers, and some of the red numbers are in Europe, some of the red numbers are in South Asia, mean that the gap is huge. The paler the color, the smaller the gap. Now, what does this gap mean? This gap is the result of many things together. Part of it is what we just saw. Education is different. If men have more education, you can expect that they will earn more than women. Part of it is the choice of occupations. Some occupations pay more than others. Some of it is progression within the occupation. If women have children, withdraw from the work, probably their bosses will not promote them in the same way, their career opportunities will not be the same. And finally, there is discrimination. So there is a combination of all these things. Even countries that had made a lot of progress, like for instance now in the United States, at entry in the labor market, there's very little in terms of gap, earning gap between men and women, at the point where the entry and the same occupation is basically the same, and then the gap widens. We are not there yet, not even there yet in developing countries, but the good thing is that, again, gaps are diminishing. Look here at the left panel is just a ratio, the wages of men to women, and down, depending on where you take the median in red or the mean in blue, but it's going down. Now that's mainly because education is going up. Because if you look at the right side of the panel, where the same thing is done for each level of education, where education 1 is no education at all, education 5 is some tertiary, and the others are gradations in between, you see that for some groups, like secondary school, the yellow line, it is going down. The green line, primary education, is going down, but it's not going down across the board. So education is doing a lot to close the gap, but there is still some more to do. Let me turn into agency, which, as I said, is the part I find perhaps most important. First thing, as was mentioned by Vijaya, is child marriage. There has been a lot of progress, but again, the bars on the left are the 6 regions of the world as we define it at the World Bank. The bars on the right part of the chart are country by country. And you see that child marriage is quite prevalent in South Asia, second only to Sub-Saharan Africa. And you see huge differences within the region, with Bangladesh always standing up as a place with very high child marriage. Here is just the proportion of girls who are already married by age 18. And you will say, well, if you get married so young, perhaps you may not be choosing for yourself. A second way to look at agencies, what the law allows you to do. The World Bank publishes annually a report that is called Women, Business and the Law, that checks the laws of every country on whether women can choose residence, having bank accounts, running a business, having an occupation, moving within the country. So a series of 8 or 10 indicators. 100 means perfect equality, like the law does not prevent a woman from doing anything that a man can do. And you see that countries like India, Bhutan, Maldives, in South Asia have pretty good scores, have 70. Not everybody in the region has that kind of score. But 70 is still not 100. So there is still room in going through the laws and regulations to ensure that they do not prevent agency. Another way to measure agency is running a business, ability to participate in a business. And here the bars you have you have 3 colors. The dark blue color means that there is a woman in the ownership of a company. The slightly lighter blue is that one woman is a top manager of a company. And the really lighter blue is when you have majority female ownership. And again, you have the regions, the 6 regions. Unfortunately, they have acronyms there, but let me go from left to right. Left is East Asia and the Pacific, then comes Eastern Europe and Central Asia, then come the rich countries, then Latin America, Middle East and North Africa. The last but one is South Asia. The last one is Sub-Saharan Africa. And you see that South Asia and Middle East and North Africa are the parts where business participation by women is among the lowest. But again, the differences are very important. Look at this map, again, districts in India and in Bangladesh, businesses headed by women. The darker blue means that there are many more businesses headed by women, the lighter green, very few. And you see that the east of the country and the south, Kerala and all that, have much higher rates. So again, there is nothing that is fate. It's not like saying like India in general. We can have success stories in many places. Finally, just working. I'm not talking now about running a business, just working. And on this, let me explain this figure that may seem a bit busy. But look first at the yellow line, that U-shaped curve. That curve shows as you move to the right in this axis, as countries become richer, male or female participation rates go down and then they go up. That's the U. Why do they go down? Because in poor countries, when countries are very poor, everybody has to work. There is no other choice. It's a matter of survival. And you see it still in agriculture, in farming societies, most women work. But then as you urbanize and as you become a bit wealthier, not everybody needs to work. Children can stay longer in school. People who are old or who are suffering from illness don't need to work because family can support. And you see that decline. And then as countries go richer and people get secondary, tertiary education, people go back to work because it's something that is part of their identity. And you see in this graph, the curves are these U curves, and the dots are countries. So these are countries plotted depending on their income per capita and their labor participation rate. If you look at the panel on the right, you see that some of the dots are red dots. Those are the countries in South Asia. That's for men. There's nothing unusual about South Asia. Participation by men in the labor market is what you will expect. But look at the left panel, which is for women. And you see that in countries like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, female participation rates are way below the yellow curve. They are high in Nepal. In Nepal, and I suspect Bihar may be also similar because of the importance of agriculture. There is still enormous participation of women, partly in Bhutan too, but it's much lower overall. Again, big differences within the country. You see that again, the Ganga River basin is where the female participation rates are the lowest. If you go to the south, if you go to the north, if you go to the east, you get better outcomes. And one interesting thing on which I will come back is that not only are South Asian countries below the U curve, in cases like India, what is disturbing is that they are drifting away from the U curve. It's not just that they are staying at the same distance, it's that labor force participation rates are declining more. And so if you look at the figure on the left, you have what happens with the participation of men and women in the labor market, depending on whether it's urban or rural. The two lines at the top are for men, urban and rural, and you see that over time, over the years, there is a decline, is what you will expect. You don't need to work until you are so old, you can stop earlier, you can study more. But the big difference is for the other lines is for women. Women in urban areas, the bottom line, participation rates are very low and stable. But in rural areas, you see female labor force participation rates coming down. And this is something on which I want to return. And so the question with this big picture on gaps, assets, returns, agency, is what can be done. And so the second block of what I want to talk about is on policies. And I want to make an important difference here between, I know this may be difficult to read from the back, but let me tell you the story. On the left, you have gender-targeted interventions. On the right, you have gender-neutral interventions. So gender-targeted interventions is our normal reaction, is we are facing a gender gap, let's do something that targets women. Access to finance for women, support for women entrepreneurs, livelihood groups, skills training. These are examples where you target women. On the right-hand side, you have things that on the surface are neutral, because they are the same for men and for women, but they may have different impacts on men and women. Faster economic growth, greater export orientation, improved infrastructure, access to electricity. And our reaction, our natural reaction is to go on the left side, and I want to argue that many of the most important things on development happen in the right side. But the question is, how do we know? How do we know what works and what doesn't? For the interventions on the left side, the ones that are targeted, the good thing is that we can have impact evaluations, like the one Gavin was referring to, where we can have a treatment group, a control group, we can see the outcomes a few years down the road and say, well, I'm confident that this made a difference. It's much more difficult, it's almost impossible to do that with big interventions. How do you decide on infrastructure, on building a corridor, on opening up the economy for imports and things like that? So there, we have to use other methods for evaluation. So let me start with the targeted interventions for which we have impact evaluations. One of the good things is that South Asia, in part with the help of, for instance, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other initiatives, has a wealth of impact evaluations. When I was the chief economist for South Asia, we built a database of all the rigorous impact evaluations we could find. And we had close to 400. Just in the case of gender, we have 78, and this account that is like 18 months old, so probably there are more by now. 78 rigorous impact evaluations on things like access to finance, entrepreneurship, inheritance of assets, safe transport, gender-based violence, and so on and so forth. And the good news, again, is that a vast majority of them are for India. Here you have a bar for each of the countries. We have something like 45 rigorous impact evaluations from India. Let me tell you one example of things that are coming up from there. One intervention which my sense has been extremely successful, as Vijaya mentioned, is the reservations in panchayats. The reservations for scheduled caste and the reservations for women. The impact evaluations, because of the sequential way in which reservations were introduced, one has a treatment and a control by comparing places where the reservation happened and places where it came later. And for instance, there is evidence that budgets are allocated differently, than when women are in charge. There is more allocation for human capital, education, and health. But also, the norms can change. There is a very famous impact evaluation that basically reads a speech about the problems of the village that is built on recordings of meetings of panchayats. So it's a generic discussion of problems of the village. And that recording, in some villages, the treatment is, in some villages, the recording has a female voice. In some villages, the recording has a male voice. And people are asked to say whether this is sensible, whether it makes sense, whether they will agree. And panchayats that have had a long history of participation by women because of the reservation have a much more positive response that, yes, this is right, when a woman is the voice reading, than the ones that have not had. So these impact evaluations can take us a long way towards assessing rigorously what is working and what is not. Here is an example. I will not go through it. What a training on stitching and tailoring targeted for women does for their participation in employment, self-employment, in hours worked, in earnings. And what you get is that the effect is strong and it grows over time. 6 months you get a positive effect, 18 months later the effect is bigger. But what I want to talk a bit more is, because we tend not to have that reaction in mind, is about the gender neutral interventions that make a difference. So same treatment, but some parts react different. And one of them is trade. What happens, and here I want to emphasize, that there are sectors that employ more women than others. So let me imagine that you engage with the world economy, and by engaging in the world economy, the sectors that tend to employ more women get more dynamism. And that has an effect. And one could argue that that's the story of Bangladesh. Bangladesh, by becoming so successful in garments, these may not be extraordinary jobs, but they are jobs that have changed enormously the country in terms of providing incomes, delaying the age of marriage, delaying the age of the first child, giving voice to women at home because they are the ones who are coming with their own savings, has to do with the apparel sector. And so one study that we did in my office while I was chief economist for South Asia was to simulate what will happen with the structure of production as China becomes more expensive and gradually vacates the area of stitching and garments and that the kind of area where countries now like Vietnam or Bangladesh are occupying more. And what we found is that there will be quite a lot to be gained as labor cost increase in China in terms of employment, in terms of earnings. Here you have what will happen to female employment in percentage terms as the prices of the cost of labor increases in China. And you see that there will be, depending on the country, the blue is exports to the US, the red is exports, the blue is exports to the European Union, the red is export to the United States. But you see that there will be significant changes in the exports. And what we find is that there will be more formalization of women, there will be more formal employment for women, there will be more earnings for women. I will not go, I know that many of you are too far for me to try to explain the figure in detail. I will not go through that. Let me give you another example. Another example is the big infrastructure for connectivity, things like the Golden Quadrilateral. And the Golden Quadrilateral has lent itself to nice evaluations because it goes, one can take places that are just not too far from the highway, but not on the highway. And that could have been plausible places for the highway to go. It's just that for geological reasons, the highway went through one place. And so you can compare districts that are like 50 kilometers from the highway with districts that are on the highway. And that kind of evaluation has been conducted. And what we find there, I will not go too much in detail, is that employment rates increased close to the corridor, and that female rates and moving out of agriculture into jobs increased for women as a result of this. The last one, and this is my last example, and the most transformational one, is electricity. Access to electricity and access to reliable electricity makes a huge difference. Again, we conducted a study in my office looking at houses that had access, not had access, but also using satellite imagery at night, where you can see whether lights blink, whether some nights you have light, some nights you don't have light. That's an indication that power is unreliable. To see what is the difference in what happens at the household level. And when you do this comparison, you find that labor force participation is higher when you are connected to the grid and when you have reliable electricity, but also that electricity, access to electricity improves the lives of women in many other ways. For instance, much less time spent collecting biomass fuel, much more time spent studying, more time on employment, less time lost due to illness, more ability to read newspapers, watch the news, to be informed. So these are examples. In other surveys here from Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, women are asked, both in households that are connected, not connected, households that are in areas with reliable electricity and not reliable electricity, about their agency, whether they can decide on their income, whether they can decide on their children's health care. And you see again the bars, especially in the case of India, are very positive. So these examples I gave, trade, infrastructure, electricity, we tend not to think too much about them. We tend to think about targeted programs. But I will think that for big development, they are a very important part of the picture. Last point, and I will finish with this. I want to have a bit of a closer look at the issue of female labor force participation. I had the privilege of being the director of the World Development Report, this flagship publication of the World Bank several years ago, when we did an issue that was on jobs. So the World Development Report on jobs, that was 2013, right after gender. And I'm personally very much convinced that jobs are extremely transformational. Sometimes economists are quite narrow in how they look at jobs. They think jobs is what you do, job is what you earn. I would say job is who we are. We define ourselves by our jobs. We define our role in society, our agency in society. And so a society where women do not work or work in household chores is a society that is denying a lot of opportunities for agency for women. So what is happening with female labor force participation, to me, is a matter of concern. Again, as I said before, it happens everywhere, that as you go through development, participation rates decrease. But in this panel, in this figure, which you may not see from the distance, so let me tell you the story of the figure. You have on the left the countries in South Asia, you have on the right the countries in East Asia. And you have on light blue men, on dark blue women. When you look at countries like Indonesia or countries like Malaysia to the extreme right, what you find is that over time, female employment grew despite the decline in female labor force participation. When you look at the countries on the left, when you look at India, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, you see that female employment went down. So there is nothing inevitable. The countries in East Asia managed to get a much bigger participation by women. So what is happening in South Asia? Why is that we're not seeing the same pattern? A lot of the decline is happening along the rural-urban gradation. As I showed before, urban female participation rates are more or less stable. It's in rural areas that we're seeing the decline. And it's happening in the gray area between purely rural and urban. There you see how what you have on the horizontal axis is the size of the places from little villages to metropolitan areas as you move to the right. And you see how, in the case of women, it goes down a lot with the size of the place. But one can argue, let me tell you the story that goes with it and what is the conventional wisdom. In the same way as in my previous blog, I said the conventional wisdom is if we face a gender gap, let's do gender-targeted interventions. On female labor force participation, a standard narrative that I see having a stronghold in India is to say what is happening is incomes are going up, we are in a patriarchal society, it's the choice of families in a society with patriarchal norms to just have women who do not need to work and can stay at home. So it's a cultural thing. It's something against which you cannot go. And I want to argue that it's not necessarily a cultural thing. Of course, I'm sure there is an element of culture. There is an element of societal norms and patriarchal culture. And as Gavin said, that's long to change. But there are elements of evidence that there is more at play. So let me show you one first impact evaluation, again from work by Rohini Panda and co-authors. They use it in REGA, the public works program, the minimum employment guarantee, to offer one intervention, and I believe this was with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, one intervention which was to arrange an account for the woman working under her name, so that the money will not go to the account of the husband, but to her account. And you will say if it's just norms, that will not have made a difference. But having their own accounts, more women decided to work because they will have the control of the money. So that suggests that it's not just norms, that what is happening within the household and any lever that we can provide that empowers women will be used, that there are more women who want to work than women who actually work. The second story I want to tell is about the jobs we see in many places. This story about what happens in the gradation between villages and big metropolitan areas. And the story, I will say there that in India what has happened is that agricultural jobs gradually disappear. People are moving out of farming. Other jobs appear, and especially construction. Construction has been in this mid-range, one of the big areas. But you don't see many of the good jobs, quote-unquote good jobs, which are in offices, in factories, where you work safely from 9 to 5, that are available. Construction jobs, you are out there, you are exposed, it's not safe. And so, caricaturing, one could say what happened in this mid-range between the villages and the urban areas is that there are not so many jobs that are suitable for women. And so what we did with colleagues Rinku Murgai and Urmila Chatterjee was to analyze labor force participation again across this gradation from village to small village, large village, small town, big metropolitan area, but to control by the nature of the jobs that were available around, not the jobs that the women themselves were having, but the jobs of the area. And what we find is that if you look at the red line, you get the probability of participation, and of course it goes down. As you move from rural to urban, it goes down. But if we control by the type of jobs available, it doesn't go down. So it's not a problem of becoming urban necessarily. It's a problem of becoming urban without the right jobs emerging. And that again is a hint as to what the big development, the big development strategies can do.